Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for the next episode of Ships of War, the series where I look at historic warships, the famous, the not so famous, and sometimes the downright notorious. And what I try to do is situate them in their historical context, but also try and look at the way that they've been represented in a particular game system. And off that, try to determine whether they've been fairly treated by the designer or whether they perhaps have been sold a little short or maybe even overpowered. You never know. Um, and just to see whether their performance in the game is likely to match their historical performance if known. Now, perhaps it's no surprise that today's contenders are going to be HMS Bellerophon and SMS Nassau from Avalon Hill's 1967 classic board game Jutland. And the reason I've chosen these two is because these are, in some respects, the earliest classes of their respective navies of dreadnought battleships. Now, obviously, I'm omitting the one and only HMS Dreadnought, which ushered in a new era for the Royal Navy and for navies all over the world, really. But I've chosen these two because they were effectively close contemporaries. So if we regard HMS Dreadnought, Britain's famous new warship, which entered service in 1906, as effectively an experimental vessel, if you will, then the three ships of the Bellerophon class, which were built almost immediately afterwards, were Britain's sort of first follow-on dreadnoughts, and they were the ones that incorporated the lessons that were learned from this ship. For the Germans, what ultimately became the four-ship Nassau class began life originally as just Nassau and Westphalen, I believe, and the other two followed on a year or two later. Now, what I'm going to do in this series is I'm going to begin trialing a new approach with the Ships of War series because there's often a lot to say about some vessels. And in order to give them their due, rather than trying to cover absolutely everything in a long sort of half-hourish session, because that can be a little bit mind-numbing, I propose instead to divide them all into two-parters, where I first look at the histories of the two ships, and then in the second part, I will compare their stats and ratings and see how these compare to them in real life. So to dive into the history, I'm just going to need to do some scene setting because while many of us are probably very familiar with the dreadnought arms race, which was embodied by the efforts of both Great Britain and Imperial Germany in the first part of the 20th century, so many new classes of dreadnoughts were being laid down and built and rapidly turning obsolete that it's very easy to forget these first generation ships, and indeed compared to their much more capable later successors, they often fade into obscurity, which I think is a bit of a pity because they represented a huge degree of innovation in their own right. And in effect, they were the products of nations that were groping, in some cases, a bit blindly towards an ideal solution. I mean, anyone who's familiar with the pre-dreadnought battleships which preceded them can see that these fellows had very interesting layouts, quite unlike the layouts of their predecessors. I mean, of course, a pre-dreadnought battleship normally would only have two main turrets. Sometimes in the case, for example, in the case of the German Brandenburgs, they had three. But you're all of a sudden dealing with much larger vessels that you're trying to cram as much firepower into them as possible. So let's take a look at HMS Bellerophon first. So Bellerophon enters service very rapidly after Dreadnought. She enters service in 1909. Now, the German ships, I must say, are built incredibly rapidly afterwards. They actually enter service a little bit later. So SMS Nassau herself enters service in 1910, a year after the Bellerophon. Now, we need to pause and think about that for a minute because it's a tribute to how rapidly the Germans were trying to catch up with the British that this class is built so very quickly. Because not only are the Germans having to design their own dreadnoughts from a standing start, they're also having to try and digest some very difficult lessons while chivying up the necessary finances to build these much more expensive ships. Now, the British face lots of technical challenges as well, but by virtue of being the people who've set up the naval race, they have a little bit of an advantage. So I'm just going to bring in some photos because these are always the good bit. I really like this one. I'm going to back off a bit so we can see it a bit better. Now, this is Bellerophon as quite new, and you can see that in many respects she resembles HMS Dreadnought quite closely. It's probably fair to describe the Bellerophon class as effectively carbon copies of dreadnoughts, and there's a couple of reasons why the British do this. Sorry, my camera's being a bit wonky. The primary one is speed of production. Now, the British had started this arms race, but they desperately needed to maintain their lead. They knew full well the German Navy wasn't going to just sit around and ponder what on earth to do. So they needed more of these ships and they needed them fast. And Dreadnought had been exhaustively tested from about 1906, 1907 onwards. But given the amount of time you need to build a ship on a good progress on a dreadnought would be roughly 3 years from laying of keel to acceptance into service, assuming nothing went wrong along the way. So these ships had to be built quickly before all of the lessons of HMS Dreadnought could be absorbed. Now, I say they were carbon copies, but they did include some very important improvements. And one of these was the presence of a secondary battery. Now, you can see two of the 4-inch guns mounted on the forward turret there. And you can just about make out two more over there, now, and plus some others clustered in the superstructure. Now, in keeping with Fisher's concept of the all-big gun battleship, Dreadnought had been equipped with a rather unconvincing secondary armament of 12-pounder guns, and that roughly equates to about 3-inch. So really not up to much in terms of taking out modern torpedo boats and destroyers, and the error was recognised. So by the time the Bellerophon and her sisters commission, they have a fairly decent battery of 4-inch guns. Otherwise, their features are pretty much that of Dreadnought. So you've got the forward turret, you have two centerline turrets aft, although the inboard one doesn't have a great field of fire because it can't shoot right aft. And then you have the wing turrets, one to port, one to starboard. Another major change from Dreadnought is that whereas Dreadnought had the single tripod mast forward, stepped aft of the funnel to help with boat handling, the Bellerophons have a much more balanced appearance. So you see they've got the two masts here, each with a fire control position. Now, the foremast represents a bit of an improvement. The initial experience with Dreadnought had shown quite clearly that the original position where it was stepped slightly aft did give you great options for boat handling, and most of the ship's boats were clustered amidships here. But the problem you had was when you were travelling at speed, a fair amount of smoke would be coming out of that forefunnel, and Dreadnought had problems with her foretop being smoked out. The Bellerophons corrected this to a degree, but that mainmast remained a problem because okay, you were stepped forward of the aft funnel, but you still got a face full of hot ash, cinder, and gases from the forefunnel. So that position was not brilliant. The other features, of course, that are very common for ships of the time are these huge torpedo nets, which were for anti-torpedo defense when you were in harbour. Now, of course, in peacetime, you wouldn't really deploy them unless you were practicing, but you can see the booms stowed here and the torpedo nets there. But otherwise, you're looking at a ship which visually is pretty much dreadnought. You know, it's handy having the masts to tell them apart, but in many respects, these ships look like HMS Dreadnought. Now, visually, how does the German ship compare? Because you can see there's a certain amount of difference in her arrangement. The Germans have actually equipped theirs with one more turret than the British have. Let me get out an early picture of Nassau. So this is Nassau as a reasonably new ship. She's slightly obscured by the boats that are alongside, but again, sorry, let me try and deal with camera wonkiness. There we go. So unlike the British ship, where you have a very prominent forecastle on which the forward turret rests, in the German ship, you've actually got a much larger forecastle. You see, the British forecastle only runs up to the level of the bridge, and then the rest of its armament is mounted on the upper deck. In Nassau, the forecastle is really quite substantial, and although you do have an upper deck which sort of comes out towards the stern, an awful lot of the ship's armament is mounted, I'll say one deck higher than on the British ship. You see, there's a uniform height there, whereas on the British ship, forward turret at forecastle level, every other turret at upper deck level. Now, this wasn't necessarily problematic because they were pretty big ships, the Bellerophons, and they were quite seaworthy, but the German arrangement arguably makes a bit more sense because the higher your guns, the better a command they have and the better you can work them in a seaway. Now, the Germans did have problems with these ships initially. They were completed without bilge keels, which I know most of you probably know this, but please indulge me. For the benefit of those who don't, the bilge keels are a bit like a false keel running down the turn of the bilges on either side of a ship's hull. And what they do is they give that ship just a little bit more bite and stability in the water. Now, not every warship has them, and Nassau certainly didn't have them on completion. But unfortunately, what was discovered very soon after the ship was completed and put through trials was that the water movements in the North Sea unfortunately corresponded quite closely to the form of the ship's hull. Now, I'm not putting those in terms that a naval architect would approve of, but effectively the end result was that they rolled rather badly, and it showed that there was a rather urgent need to give them a decent set of bilge keels. Now, this was very rapidly done, and they also benefited from being designed with another German innovation, which was the Fram anti-rolling tank, which used controlled flooding and a weight system to help prevent the ship from rolling excessively. And this was a marvelous device because, oh, sorry, my camera's slipped again. The Fram anti-rolling tanks were marvelous because the British had no equivalent to them, and they were a major contributor to these ships being impressively stable gun platforms. Now, they were a bit unsatisfactory in other respects because the problem with the layout of the guns, and I'm just going to go back to the ship's counter here, as you can see, whereas the British ship suffers from slight inefficiencies in that whichever broadside it's engaged on, one of its turrets will be out of action effectively. With the German ship, whichever side it's engaged on, two of its turrets are going to be out of action because there was no way you could cross-deck fire with these things. And that was a very unfortunate design flaw because you effectively had a lot of wasted weight, and that you could only really engage with all your weapons if you were entering some kind of naval melee. But by the time these ships were designed, it was pretty well established that the most efficient way to fight was in line. And so you were hardly ever going to find a situation where you were going to be fighting two enemies on opposite broadsides. You were most likely only going to face an enemy fleet on one broadside. So a bit of a shame there that the Germans didn't do themselves any favors with that arrangement. But such was the pace of construction that both Brits and Germans repeated these layouts in their following classes. So what about their service careers? Well, I'll deal with Bellerophon first. She had some minor modifications made. This is a wartime photo of her, and if you recall the previous photo, you'll see her masts have shrunk somewhat. In about 1915, the masts were shortened because they didn't really need that extra height for signalling, and improvements to wireless telegraphy technology meant that they didn't need those excessively high masts either. These were perfectly adequate. And in an age when targeting depended on, both British and German really, depended to a degree on being able to gauge the height of a ship's masts, having shorter masts was a little bit of an advantage. The other thing the British soon realised, and this photo is taken a little bit before it happened, is that some of these 4-inch guns were not all that well placed and didn't have a good command. And also, if you're in a situation where you're facing destroyers as well as enemy capital ships, you don't really want these things on the turret tops because the blast will not do them any favours. So a bit later in the war, these were all moved into enclosed positions in the superstructure, not armoured, but still with a good field of fire. A year after this photograph was taken, the other innovation, well, I won't call it an innovation, more of a step in the right direction, saw the removal of the torpedo netting because it really was not up to much. And after the loss of the battleship Majestic, the British realised that it wasn't really worth keeping that dead weight around. The German ship, by comparison, saw very little change during the war. There wasn't really too much they needed to alter or innovate over. The Germans did actually still have their torpedo netting in mid-1916, and it wasn't until the next year that most fleet units lost theirs. Both these ships had fairly busy, if uneventful, careers. They were both quite active during the war. Both of them fought at the Battle of Jutland, but neither of them was seriously tested in an existential way. Nassau was ultimately surrendered along with the rest of the German fleet, and Bellerophon was turned into a training ship in 1919, and then to comply with both the financial state of Britain after the war and the demands of the Washington Treaty subsequently was discarded. So they both had an extremely short life, but were still very interesting ships for all that. So there we go, a very potted history of these two. I've tried not to say too much because there's some details that will become relevant in the next video, but I will save that for when I dive into the details of what's on their stat sheets and ship counters, and how well the game models them as historic fighting vessels. And until then, thank you all so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.